Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're looking way beyond the physical wreckage of a storm or an earthquake, and we're zeroing in on the hidden casualties of natural disasters. We usually measure a disaster's impact by counting up collapsed buildings and damaged roads. But what about the invisible lifelines that actually sustain those communities? Today, we're going to explore how disasters fundamentally tear apart ecosystems, biodiversity, and really the entire complex web of life that we all rely on.
To really grasp this, there's a story from our source material that just completely hit the nail on the head. Months after a massive typhoon, a group of students went to visit a coastal barangay. Now, the homes are rebuilt, the power was back on, but something was just wrong. The protective mangrove forest that used to be there? Totally gone. There was no bird song, and the local fishing boats were coming back practically empty. But an elderly resident pointed out to the water at a single lone surviving mangrove tree and said this really profound thing. That tree reminds us that recovery isn't only about rebuilding houses. It's also about bringing life back.
So let's take a second to think about that. When you imagine recovery, what comes to mind first? A brand new house? A newly paved road? We are so conditioned to see recovery as just a giant construction project. But true recovery? That means a river flowing clean again, kids playing outside without fear, and nature actually regenerating. Because communities really only heal when people and nature recover together. Section 1. Destroying our natural services. Before we can even measure the damage, we have to understand exactly what we're losing. In the ecological world, we call these ecosystem services. Basically, these are the provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural benefits that natural environments give us. Think of them as the unseen engines running in the background, keeping our towns and cities alive. They provide literally everything from the water we drink to the natural barriers that keep storm surges from wiping out coastlines. Let's dive right into how disasters completely dismantle these systems, starting with provisioning services, the tangible stuff we need to survive. Floods and droughts absolutely decimate our food supply, wiping out crops and starving livestock. Then you have storms and landslides that instantly pollute our clean water sources with mud, chemicals, and waste. And of course, extreme winds or wildfires destroy crucial raw materials like timber. A community's immediate, basic physical survival is directly tied to these natural provisions. Now, here's where things get really concerning. When a disaster destroys regulating services, it actually actively increases future disaster risks. It's a total vicious cycle. For example, when wetlands get damaged, they lose their ability to act like giant natural sponges for heavy rain. So the next flood, it's going to be way worse. When forests burn down, they release all their stored carbon, destabilizing the climate further. And when a storm surge rips up coral reefs and mangroves, the coast literally loses its built-in armor. Nature's defense systems are just gone. And it doesn't stop there. The very foundation of how an ecosystem grows and how a community bonds gets shattered. Landslides strip away rich topsoil, making it nearly impossible for new plants to grow. Animal habitats are completely wiped out. Plus, we lose cultural services. The parks, lakes, and scenic areas where people actually gather and connect lose their beauty and their value. The physical environment that gives a community its unique identity is left heavily scarred. Section 2. The loss of biodiversity. So, when we look at the biological casualties, they generally split into two camps. First, you've got the direct impacts. These are immediate and honestly devastating. Mass die-off of wildlife, crushing habitat destruction, and this terrifying thing called genetic loss, where the surviving animal populations shrink so much that inbreeding makes future recovery super difficult. But then you have the indirect, long-term effects, which are just as insidious. Aggressive invasive species swoop in to take over weakened native habitats. And worst of all, we see recovery bottlenecks. This is a huge issue where hasty, panicked human reconstruction actually prevents the environment from healing, basically locking the ecosystem in a permanently degraded state. Section 3. Assessing the environmental damage. Knowing all of this, it's clear we can't just blindly rebuild. We need a structured plan, specifically a Natural Resource Assessment, or NRA. It works in phases. First, you pull together a team of local experts. Second, you identify and prioritize key resources like watersheds or coastlines. Third, and this is absolutely crucial, you collect baseline data to analyze risks before a disaster ever strikes. Why? Because in phase 4, right after a disaster hits, your team can go back to those exact same spots, check for new contamination or erosion, and figure out what needs urgent stabilization. Having that baseline data is a total game changer because you know exactly what the ecosystem looked like before. Section 4. Healing people and communities. Now, while the environment is suffering, obviously human lives are being profoundly disrupted too. And we aren't just talking about lost property. Disasters cause a massive loss of safety, dignity, social networks, and simply the feeling of having control over your own life. Psychological impacts like deep grief, anxiety, and a profound sense of displacement, they're almost inevitable. Recognizing that human trauma is the very first step toward actually helping a community heal. And when it comes to human support, the clock is ticking. The first 72 hours after a crisis are incredibly urgent. In this specific window, the focus has to be 100% on ensuring basic safety, trying to offer some sense of calm, and getting practical, immediate help to the people who need it most. During those critical first few days, anyone can actually step up using what's called psychological first aid. It's built on 3 incredibly simple principles: look, listen, and link. You look for people in extreme distress or who have urgent medical needs. You listen by staying close and being a gentle presence, and this is key, without ever pressuring survivors to talk about their trauma if they aren't ready. Finally, you link people. You connect them to food, water, their families, and expert care. It's just a fantastic, actionable framework for immediate support. But what happens after those first 3 days? Long-term human recovery requires a totally different playbook. We have to help reestablish daily routines to bring back some semblance of normal life. We need to promote social connections and group activities so people can process their grief together. Also, interestingly, it is incredibly important to limit media exposure to distressing disaster images. People often forget this, but endless scrolling through news cycles can deeply re-traumatize survivors. And naturally, anyone experiencing severe, lingering trauma needs to be referred to clinical specialists. Section 5. Protocols for sustainable recovery. When you look at the actual protocols for recovery, a really fascinating comparison pops up between large, formal institutions and local grassroots barangays. Institutions naturally rely on top-down structures, things like emergency operations centers and official business continuity plans. But down on the ground, the local barangay relies heavily on the bayanihan system. This is all about mobilizing local volunteers for rescues, setting up community stockpiles, and figuring out how to diversify local incomes. Both levels absolutely need resilient design when they rebuild, but it's that grassroots level that really thrives on participatory planning and tight-knit social cohesion to speed up the recovery process. Section 6. Documenting a narrative of a barangay. There's one final, often overlooked step to all of this: preserving the memory. Documenting a community's disaster experience is vital for social healing and for preparing the next generation. First, you have to build trust and get ethical consent, always respecting what the survivors have been through. Second, you collect their oral histories and use visual tools like participatory mapping. Third, you carefully catalog all of this using transparent metadata so it's safe. And fourth, which is honestly the best part, you return the history right back to the community through exhibits or local archives. It honors what they went through and celebrates their incredible resilience. Which brings us to our final thought today. I really want to leave you with this question to chew on. What does true healing actually look like? If you walk into a town a year after a major disaster, is it healed just because the roads are paved and the roofs are patched? Or is it truly healed because the local ecosystem is thriving again? Neighbors are more connected, and that one lone mangrove tree we talked about earlier has finally sparked the growth of a whole new forest. Remember, we can't just measure recovery by the concrete we pour. We have to measure it by the lives, relationships, and natural environments we restore. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.